Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming in. Today we are opening up the Mayor's Blue Ribbon panel to further our discussions that we had earlier regarding the future of PWSA. Today, so I appreciate everyone's participation. We do have some members of the panel also on the phone. Appreciate the audience being here. Today's is an update, is to really give the opportunity for Steve Steckler and his team at Infrastructure Management Group the opportunity to talk to us and the public about all the work that they've been doing over the last several months. He has a presentation prepared. There's been a deep dive, a lot of conversations happening within PWSA to understand sort of how we got to where we are, and starting to look at potential recommendations to come back in the future so that we can give the residents of the city the kind of water and sewer authority that they deserve. I have to say that over the last 6 months as well, you've had a lot of hard work by the people at PWSA, by the board. Independent of this process has been going on its own, not meant to interfere with the operations of the authority, but with the leadership at PWSA, the board, Debbie Listician, who was the board chair that took over, with the help of some of the former board members, Alex Thompson, who's here with us at the table. There's been a lot of progress made just in the interim 6 months. So with that being said, today's order is going to be about a half-hour presentation led by Mr. Steckler. He'll then come to the table and open up himself and his team to questions by the panel. My challenge is to ask hard questions. Nothing is out of bounds. If you have concerns or advice relating to the presentation, please do so. As I said from the very beginning, the mayor felt very strongly that all of this should happen in a very public, open, transparent manner. So this meeting today is being televised to the public as well. So before we get started, any questions or input by members of the panel or on the phone? Yes.
Maybe you could just remind us of the timeline from this point on through the end of this.
That'll be part of the presentation today
okay.
As well, but there will be another meeting. Today was sort of to catch up and to sort of frame what the roadmap is going to look like over the next couple months. This is the first of 3 public meetings that we'll have that'll lead to a set of recommendations. It was very clear when we engaged IMG that there'd be a menu of options. This process is not being intended to lead to any singular outcome. It's meant to sort of provide City Council, the mayor, the controller, the board, all the public officials with a set of options as to what the future path of PWSA could be. We'll go through some of those today. And so this is the first of a series of 3 meetings. I believe the next one is the middle of next month and then followed in early October, meant to bring this process to a conclusion. So, sure. So with that, I'll turn over the mic to Steve Steckler from Infrastructure Management Group.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you again, especially in these circumstances. Today is the first of our interim reports, first of 3 meetings, and we're going to be talking about primarily about the options that we'll be investigating, as well as some initial impressions. Where's my clicker? Some initial impressions that we've had as our teams have gone through the PWSA organization and through some of the sites, the facilities and assets, and also interviews with some of the senior administrators and with the staff. To just remind you of our agenda today, I'll introduce members of the team. Some of them are here today, as well as the agendas for the next panel meetings, sort of give you a flavor for our scope of work again, and highlights of our work to date, and then, as I said, some initial observations on PWSA, and we'll go through the briefing book that you have in front of you, and it's your bedtime reading for the next several weeks before the September 28th meeting. And then we'll have some Q&A and what I hope is some good lively discussion, not just a Q&A, but discussion of the options and the process we're going through as we investigate which of these alternatives is best for the city of Pittsburgh and for its ratepayers. Infrastructure Management Group is serving as the lead firm, of course, but we have technical subcontractors that include Tetra Tech, which has a local office here of several hundred people, Uberlytics, which specializes in asset management, Woodward and Curran, those are the operations specialists, and Evolve EA, which is a green infrastructure specialist firm. On the finance side, when I say finance, I'm referring to the liabilities, balance sheets, revenues, et cetera, of PWSA. That includes Grant Thornton and the Meridian Group. The legal team consists of West Group and Buchanan Ingersoll. Community outreach, actual size, and again, Evolve EA because of their relationship with the local environmental community. And on ratepayer impact, a very important part of the analysis, IMG is leading that with the assistance of K. Beeler Consulting. So we really have a full roster of specialists that cover every area of possible research into PWSA. The work for this panel is organized around 3 meetings. Today, of course, where we'll cover the work plan, progress to date, and our initial observations. The September 12th meeting, I think, is going to be a great one. And for those folks who aren't here, that's the meeting I think that you really want to be at, because we have 2 featured speakers, presenters at that meeting. These folks are both very distinguished individuals from their respective cities. We will have Lauren Brookie, who is a member, former chairman and current member of the board of directors of the Tulsa Metropolitan Utility Authority, which is a combined water sewer authority, somewhat similar to PWSA. It's actually a little larger. They have been in the process of a massive internal improvement, restructuring, for the past several years. And she has graciously agreed to come out and share her experience with those reforms in Tulsa. Also, she'll be joined by Dan Evans. Dan is an equally distinguished member of the community and business community in Indianapolis. And he, in Indianapolis, the water and sewer utility had been operated by public employees and then by private contractor employees, by a private contractor. And then in 2011, they were transferred to a private, nonprofit public trust. It's actually one of the largest public trusts in the country. They already controlled the gas and steam and heat in Indianapolis, as well as a number of other water and number of other utilities around Indianapolis. But they operated as a nonprofit, very much as a hospital nonprofit, like UMPC, UPMC, I'm sorry, would function. And that's a very interesting model. And they've been quite successful. And Dan will come and tell you all about that. Dan is president of the Board of Trustees there. And that's a self-perpetuating organization where the trustees appoint the board of directors, and then the trustees have a rolling appointment. So it remains permanent, perpetual, and politically independent. November 8th includes we'll also have the initial observations on PWSA's finances. Our finance team and legal teams are just getting started now. The capital improvement planning, which Tetra Tech will be overseeing the analysis of that process, and that's very critical. As we'll learn through this process, there are a couple of two huge challenges hanging over PWSA. One is the organization, but the other is its capital improvement needs. And that need is so large that it's imperative for the sake of the ratepayers in PWSA that be done properly. And finally, the legal implications for the restructuring options. Some things are going to be more easily done legally. Others are going to have more challenges, let's say. And we'll hear about that, at least the initial observations on those tasks. And finally, on November 8th, we'll have the final presentation on our final findings. including a final assessment of the restructuring options. And we say an assessment, it's not the same as a recommendation. We actually will have both a quantitative analysis in terms of ratepayer impacts of each of the restructuring options, as well as qualitative issues with each of the options. And that includes implementation, it includes durability, and a number of other factors that will play into your decision about which option you believe is best. And we hope to guide you in that regard with the materials and information presented to you between now and then. We started off the work with a kickoff meeting with city officials, but also with the PWSA directly. We met with the management and staff, as you see up here in the corner. And we're able to obtain a lot of information and get an idea for some of the frustrations that the staff and managers are dealing with at PWSA and some of the challenges that they're having to use their best efforts to try to overcome. We then began our specialty team investigations, starting with our operations, maintenance, and asset management folks. And they came in and toured the plants and interviewed people, and continuing some of the interviews that we had done previously, they went through the information that had been supplied by PWSA, and they've reached some tentative conclusions. They do have more work to do, however, so some of the information I'm going to be presenting to you today is really their preliminary observations. And the restructuring guidebook is intended to do a couple of things, which you have in front of you. It's to explain explain each of the options, and then provide you some background material for where these options have been implemented or considered in various cities around the country. And you can see that in most cases, there are two sides to every option. You could also see that sometimes the opinions in favor of one or the other run passionately, and their view of the evidence and what that evidence means in each of the cities runs one way, runs on both sides. So it'll be interesting reading, and I don't think it'll put you to sleep, and if it does put you to sleep, I'm sure the nightmare will wake you up. We looked at the governance and organizational assessment. We have been, that will be continuing, and have also looked initially at the processes. We have some findings in there. None of them are very good. And then this is the first of the panel education sessions. Now, this part down here defines what we have begun doing in terms of the operations assessment, as well as the maintenance and asset management. Now, that's going to continue for the next couple of months with Tetra Tech's work and Evolve and some of the other folks who are involved in the analysis of the specific operations and assets, condition, what are the studies that are going on, things like that. We're even looking at the support services, some of which are provided internally and some of which are provided by the city on behalf of PWSA. That's going to lead to this. These inputs from here and here lead to a tactical, financial, and legal assessment. And that's essentially pulling together the pieces and say, what does it look like we have here? Where should we refine our analysis when we go into the home stretch for looking at the individual options? During this whole process, of course, we'll be engaged in the community, and I'm pleased to have folks here from Actual Size and Evolve who will be leading that effort for community outreach. It's a very important part. And as you can see from the briefing book, community stakeholders of all kinds have very different perspectives on the options that are before PWSA, but those perspectives may be affected by what we'll find out with regard to the finances and projected rate impacts of the various options. All this information comes together in this strategic impact analysis, and that's where we develop the final information on the different options. And then comes the final education session, and that would be November 8th, where we have the final information and findings with regard to the various options. And those options break down into these here. And then you will all be asked to consider how to go forward with PWSA. Any questions about this approach? No. Okay, we'll have time, plenty of time, of course, to go back through it. There are three basic categories of restructuring options. And these are organized in not any particular order, but we'll start from right to left. The internal improvement option involves a number of different pieces. It can include selected outsourcing. PWSA already has some initiatives underway to improve some of the customer service aspects where there's selected outsourcing. Other utilities that have done selected outsourcing have gone even much further, actually, where essentially the utility is divided into a number of different organizational components that are outsourced. Engineering services, for example, is already outsourced, one would argue, too outsourced at PWSA. In other cases, all customer services are outsourced. Rate making is outsourced. A number of all support services are outsourced. So selected outsourcing is an option. But the operating organization itself and certainly the assets are not. The major internal restructuring contract via city contract is an example of what happened in Tulsa. One of the reasons we wanted Tulsa here was because of what they have in common with the city of Pittsburgh. There is actually a lease contract between the city and the PWSA. That contract gives the city a great deal of leverage over what happens at PWSA. And the fact that the city owns the assets or has beneficial control of the assets can act as an enforcement mechanism for changes, internal changes that otherwise are not durable. As you'll see from what you read here and from our discussion today, the big problem with internal improvement is its durability. And one of the aspects of internal restructuring is the internal improvement is regionalization. Regionalization is something that's been talked about from time to time by folks in the area, and given the fragmentation, extraordinary fragmentation of water and sewer services in the greater Pittsburgh region, it is something to keep in mind as we talk about the options here. Almost every one of these small systems out there, and not just PWSA, are facing very similar problems. Crumbling infrastructure, underinvestment, and frankly under management of the assets. The challenge for those systems are almost as great as they are for PWSA, and there is a solid argument to be made that these issues are better addressed as via regionalization, via a regionalized entity, and so improving PWSA could be, depending upon the option selected, could be a first step toward inviting other communities to come in and join PWSA. PWSA is not capable of being the base entity for that structure right now, but perhaps it could be in a few years. The second is a permanent transfer, A here, and under that permanent transfer there are several different options. One is to transfer it to a private nonprofit, as Indianapolis did. The other is to transfer to a for-profit entity, and Pennsylvania actually has an unusual number of those that have done that recently. For Scranton, for example, this is a private regulated for-profit, and the other is to transfer to a public agency. Alcosan would be an obvious example, but there could be others out there as well. That would include transferring the assets, the operations, and beneficial control to a different entity. The third option involves a transfer of options, the transfer of operations, but they are very different, and it's different. They're both very different than what occurred here under Veolia. The typical operations and maintenance contract for water and sewer systems in the U.S. has been it was 30 years ago, it was 5 years. 20 years ago, it became 10 years. And now with the recent IRS ruling on whether private operations and maintenance contracts jeopardize the tax-exempt status of the debt issued by the utility, it's been easier to move to 20 years. So that's an option, and there are benefits of it in the PWSA's case. But it's an even greater, even longer version of that is a long-term lease. Now, under an operations and maintenance contract, the assets themselves continue to be owned by PWSA or the city of Pittsburgh. It's only the operations and maintenance and a lot of the management activities and support services that are taken over and become the sole responsibility of a contractor. As I said, it does have its benefits, and there are some places where it's worked well. There are also some places where it hasn't. The long-term lease concession is something that has been talked about for a long time in the U.S., and it's actually occurred quite frequently in the U.S. with toll roads and airports and other major assets, even city halls, where a developer will come in and build, finance, and operate a facility, an infrastructure facility, to the city's specifications. The developer then operates that facility for enough time for him or her to recover that investment, for investors to recover that investment. Typically, those concessions range from about 40 years to 99 years. In this situation, it will take a long time. With PWSA's capital needs, the minimum lease term would be about 50 years. So it's not the same as selling it, because the city or the PWSA still owns those assets, but they are leased for operations and for improvement according to specifications established by the city to a concessionaire for a long term. There are several cities, smaller cities in the country, that have used that model recently to take over systems and provide much needed repairs in systems that were having persistent capital and operating problems. It can work very well. Depends on how it's written and depends on the circumstances. So that's what we're looking at with the transfer. You notice I really have tried to stay neutral on all of these options. They all do have their benefits. You cannot categorically say that one works and one doesn't. The issue you will be presented with is, does it work best for Pittsburgh? Each of these options has different implications for ratepayers, because they have different implications for how the multi-billion-dollar capital improvement program that's necessary here is going to be handled. Handled poorly or planned poorly, that capital program will cause water and sewer rates in the city to skyrocket. Handled well, those water and sewer rates will go up, but not as much as they would have in a poorly managed situation. So while we're focused on while everyone focuses on the organization, it's the management of that capital improvement program that's important. And whether it's regionalization as part of that or not, it is the most challenging thing that you will have to get a handle on as you weigh these options, because it really will have multi-billion-dollar implications for this community over the next 20, 30, and 40 years. These options, implementing any of these options, will be hard and it will be challenging, but these are the people who have to buy in. One of the things that seems clearest in our initial view of PWSA is that you can't improve this organization and you can't solve its infrastructure problems by a selective initiative here and a selective initiative there. The interim director and the interim CFO and some other folks at PWSA have done a yeoman's effort within their limited resources and within their limited mandate However, I would say those fall into the category of an initiative here and an initiative there. What is needed is a holistic vision of how the utility will be improved and how it will deal with its enormous challenges of improving its assets over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. Everyone has to buy in with that because it's going to be expensive. It's going to be hard. And if you have some people saying, well, I just don't agree with that option, or we should have done something else, it won't work because everyone has to buy in. All of these people here. Does it have to be unanimous? No. But it does tell you that this is something where the entire program has to come together, it has to be bought into, and you have to go forward with it. You can't do it piecemeal. That's the situation you're facing. Other utilities can do it bit by bit, but not here. I told you I'd share with us our initial impressions, and I want to caution ahead of time, these are initial impressions. We have early information from our teams that are out there. We have a lot more information coming in. Some of this is going to be startling to you. Some of it's going to be a little scary. The operations and asset management folks that we had come in were frankly shocked at what they saw. They have seen a lot of utilities around the country, large and small. And for a large utility, their expectations are always that it's going to be, that certain basic things are going to be there. In PWSA's case, most of them weren't. Our impression at the senior management level is that PWSA is barely holding on thanks to its interim director, its CFO, and the yeoman-like dedication of most of its staff. We were impressed with the dedication of these folks. It would be very easy to become despondent in this atmosphere, but they haven't. The recent initiatives under senior management could address some of the few well-known problems, such as billing. And that's a good thing because those are the things that people notice most. And if you can fix those, that'll buy you some time to deal with the more pressing problems out there. The financial situation will be slightly improved by the financial restructuring that the CFO is working on now, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to the financial issues facing the utility. Its structural and governance organization are simply not suited to its enormous operational and physical problems, nor its multi-billion-dollar repair ambitions. This organization has to step up its game. It can't do it by itself. And these are some quotes here taken from the various members of the team in their operations and asset management review. The first one mirrors what I said before. I like the term foxhole valor of the folks at PWSA out there for doing their job in some very difficult circumstances and lacking the tools that they need. However, in addition to that valor, we did observe that there was an entrenched culture of operational apathy coupled with the absence of skill sets and operating systems that are absolutely essential for a utility its size, and I'll talk about an example of that. The mismatch is, it's one thing for Pittsburgh to have an aging system in demonstrably worse condition than any other water utility its size in the country. It's quite another to ask the organization in its current form to be able to handle that situation and the billions of dollars in new expenditures that will be required over the next few years to deal with that. An organization that's so bereft of the most basic work culture and management tools that we typically see in even average performing utilities. There are pockets of technical acumen and skill throughout the organization, but most of those folks and the observations of our field staff were either underutilized or overwhelmed by the urgency of what they're being asked to do. There is no evidence of any structured staff development or training program to correct this issue. We noticed bits and pieces of a program, but for some reason, the employees don't take advantage of it at the same rates that we have seen in other utilities. Now, in this case, the start of the sentence here is there appears to be no technical ability to maintain the water treatment plant with no evidence of a maintenance program. I think that's probably a bit of a broad brush, but it speaks to the fact that the equipment that is there is old, it is in a difficult state of repair, and even some of the equipment which has fairly basic technical understanding requirements to operate it are not being operated properly. Maintenance, for example, for a system this size, you should be at least recording your maintenance activities in a in a log that allows you to retrieve that information to be able to track back through a repair. That doesn't exist. The information is kept on note cards, index cards, and occasionally a logbook. Although many staff conducted themselves with integrity and seriousness of purpose, and I do want to stress that, when our teams walked into the plants and walked into the equipment rooms, they were stunned by what they saw. Pipe rooms that are flooded from leaks in the pipes that could have been fixed by tightening simple, easily available bolts. In some of those cases, they wondered why is no one tightening these bolts? It's leaking. Why is this stuff laying around on the floor? It's a hazard. Isn't somebody going to clean that up? This is not to say that PWSA does not need additional staff. It needs additional skilled staff. The high level of staff on short-term disability was stunning, about 20%. That, according to the information that they were able to find. That is additional evidence of a dysfunctional culture. It could stem from either an ineffective safety program where 20% of the workforce gets hurt and goes on disability, or because of a long-standing culture that accepts that kind of behavior. In a well-run utility, the typical percentage of staff on short-term disability will be at 5% or below. In terms of setting priorities, there is no means of accurately creating a meaningful priority list of rehabilitation or repairs other than finding that it's broken. And indeed, the maintenance staff, despite their best efforts, were constantly chasing breaks and making repairs because that's all they had time to do. And in fact, it's all they had the information to know about. The SCADA systems in a water and wastewater treatment plant are essentially what we'll call it the monitoring system for all of the treatment and pumping processes. It's kind of a basic thing. It's what you get whenever you make a utility. You have a SCADA system. Some of them are fairly rudimentary and some of them are quite advanced. But in this case, we couldn't find the people who were supposed to be monitoring them. The system is not very sophisticated in the first place. In the case and in some cases when the people were, of course they were manning them, but their knowledge of what to do with this system, which wasn't capable of very much, but their knowledge of what to do with this system was pretty rudimentary, meaning that they had been there a long time, but they had never been trained on the basics of how to use and understand the information coming out of these systems. Almost every piece of rotating equipment seen at the water treatment plant, or other than the newly installed items, was a condition of significant neglect. Pump body seals were leaking with evidence of scaled up chemicals and fresh leakage that could have been prevented with a little tightening and some easily accessible bolts. I would characterize PWSA as one of the largest irrigation systems in the country. It produces roughly 23 billion gallons a year in drinkable water. More than 50% of that ends up in the ground. Doesn't make it to customers' houses. That is an incredible loss, truly unprecedented for a system this size. Now, Atlanta's system is quite a bit bigger, and it does have a lot of water loss, but it doesn't approach this. What to fix first? Again, money is being spent on perceived need of the moment, and you can understand why, rather than in a strategic and comprehensive facility-wide risk-based approach. And that risk-based approach is essential to the intelligent and efficient spending of that large capital improvement program that's going to be required. Let me explain a little bit of what I mean here. One approach to asset management is to say that if it's going to be, that you replace it every 5 years. You replace a part every 10 years, every 20 years. You build a new one of these every 10 years, or another one of these every 30 years, or the like. That's typically, and it's reliable, and it's why people say, we're doing the maintenance, we're doing it proactively, we have it all planned. That also wastes a lot of money. The smarter thing to do, and this is one of the things that private owners and operators of the utilities do, is they use a risk-based asset management program. I'll give you an example. Milwaukee's wastewater system was considered one of the best run in the country. It had won all kinds of awards for water, for its treatment processes, for its stormwater control, and they were justifiably very, very proud. They were even proud of the bioproduct that they sold called Milorganite out there. If you play golf, you probably had it on your golf courses out there. They were very proud of that, even though they lost money on every bag. The contractor came in, though, a private operator came in 1997, and their comment was, yes, this is a very well-run system, and it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They had such a they were the opposite of risk-based decision-making. They had such a large operating margin, a large margin in there, that they really didn't have to pay attention to what was going on down there because they operated with a huge safety margin there. That safety margin was very expensive. It had been costing the ratepayers of Milwaukee unnecessarily millions of dollars a year. So United Water came in and essentially, without laying off any employees, essentially replaced that paradigm by installing protocols and technology that allowed it to get dramatically better information about what was going on in the sewage collection, stormwater collection, and treatment system. With that information, they were able to have much better information they'd had before on what was happening to the equipment out there in terms of its risk of failure. As a result, the actual safety of the security of treatment quality continued. In fact, even got a little better. But the cost went down dramatically. The operations and maintenance costs in Milwaukee went down 34%. 34%, enough to allow the MMSD to give its ratepayers a 16.5% reduction in rates. So when I talk about a good asset management approach versus a normal asset management approach, that's what I mean. PWSA right now uses a fairly rudimentary approach to asset management, and it's understandable. It doesn't have the systems that do a whole lot else. That's really intended for the lowest common denominator. By shifting to a criticality focus that looks at all the utility and focuses primarily on the most critical pieces that are of highest risk of failure and understanding very deeply how and when they fail. That leads to an efficient capital improvement program, and the difference can be hundreds of millions of dollars. And finally, on strategy, I told you before that one of the things it's going to take to turn around the organization and to turn around water and sewer services in Pittsburgh is going to be having a holistic approach where all of the organization, physical, operational, and financial problems are addressed together in one package. Not in piecemeal initiatives, but in one package that everyone agrees to up front, and then provides the necessary resources to improve those processes. It can be done in 2 stages. The first is to deal with the organization, to equip it with the resources that it needs, and to address the most critical problems. Now that's a limited budget. It's not multi-billion dollars. That means but once that happens, then the organization would be capable of dealing with the multi-billion dollar decisions that it's going to face in dealing with its infrastructure. That's what we mean by a holistic strategy that is bought into by the stakeholders. One of the things we promised to do, and the mayor promised to do, is to make this process transparent and to reach out to the various stakeholders in the community And in that regard, I'm pleased to have Mary Kiernan and Christine Mordor from Evolve. Go ahead.
Why don't I talk briefly about the outreach that we are setting up? My firm is located here in Pittsburgh, in East Liberty, Actual Size, and we will be setting up this week a website, microsite, pwsablueribbon.org.com. And on that site, the documents that you have before you, as well as Steve's presentation and a Q&A will be posted, as well as any other meeting notes that we have along the way. We'll also have a commenting section on the site where City of Pittsburgh residents, stakeholders, groups can go ahead and upload either a document they want to share with our group or actually a comment. Will require an email address and your zip code. And that's just simply so we can sort and make sure that we're addressing the concerns of the city residents, and that's why we require the zip code. We'll be sharing those comments with the committee as they do their investigation, and as well as we expand our Q&A section of the site, hopefully addressing as many concerns as possible. We have found that this is the best way to reach as many residents that want to participate in the conversation in the short period of time that we have to do it. I'm also going to reach out, we've already started the process of reaching out to the libraries in the city of Pittsburgh and leaving copies of both the report you have in front of you as well as the presentation. So if someone doesn't have a computer but want to go ahead and access those documents, they can go to their local library in the city and do that as well and read them. They won't be able to take them with them. They can read them there and leave them for the next person that might want to see it. So that is right now the setup for the community outreach. Again, keeping it as transparent and as also as best getting comments from the City of Pittsburgh residents that we can get, so Steve and his team can go ahead and use that as they're doing their due diligence. Thank you.
Christine, let's talk about our outreach to
Sure. Yep. Absolutely. Good morning. We are in charge, while the general community outreach is being done through Mary's firm, we're in charge with addressing the groups that have deep technical expertise or concerns specifically regarding environmental issues. So we've identified a number of groups as a starting point, but are open to folks contacting us who are interested. And in particular, we'll be meeting with them in small groups or one-on-one, gathering their concerns and sharing that with the team. Our work and our kind of record of our conversations will be on the website so that anybody can access that information and that those concerns can be shared. I know that there are shared concerns among many groups, and so we want to make sure that they know that they're heard and that the team can respond to those issues. So.
And Christine is also going to be working with Tetra Tech to bring even more. Tetra Tech already has a strong expertise in green infrastructure, but her firm really focuses on that area. And in the case of sewer and especially stormwater, the green infrastructure component could be one of those pieces that that reduces the capital improvement program needs perhaps dramatically. So it's also, even though it's not the primary part of what we're doing, we're taking into consideration the processes at PWSA that take green infrastructure into consideration. The beginning of the book contains a description, a narrative on the options that we'll be exploring, and I would advise you to read that and understand what those options are. I actually can't say to you now which of these options is going to turn out to have the most favorable economic picture. I can't even tell you which of the ones that are going to be relatively easy to implement, although certainly internal improvement is always the easiest to implement. In each of those, for each of those options, we've organized information that can help you understand what's happened at other communities that have looked at the options, that have implemented those. And again, this is the chart we went through earlier. The reason those options do vary in terms of their impact on ratepayers. They vary for several different reasons. For example, one of the questions we have to pose here is if the capital improvement program, and let's focus on that for a moment, not the organization. If the capital improvement program is going to be literally billions of dollars over the next 30, 40 years, can it be financed with tax-exempt debt, or does it have to be financed with private financing, taxable financing? That's not determinant, but it is a factor. Private companies argue, private utilities, as well as the private lessee operators, those who are looking for long-term concessions, argue that they are actually more efficient in their capital programs by more than enough to offset the difference in the cost of capital. And they are more efficient and more focused on providing an efficient capital improvement program than even the investor-owned utilities. So their argument is that the solutions that they would offer are superior for ratepayers, despite the fact that they do not have access to tax-exempt debt. Another factor is that certain of the investor-owned utilities out there, water, gas, electric, have the ability to pass along the capital program, the future needs of the capital program to their entire rate base. That's an important consideration, because if you don't share the costs with a larger rate base, then all of those costs have to be paid for by the users, but by PWSA's current users. If your scenario is internal improvement coupled with regionalization, then everybody in the region is in the same boat. If Community X has a severe storm overflow problem that it's completely incapable of dealing with in its population base, and Community Y has an underground issue that it doesn't have the expertise or the financial capacity to deal with, and you've got literally 100 different water and sewer authorities in the communities around PWSA's service area, logic would tell you that a lot of economies of scale and a lot of efficiencies can be gained through regionalization. But the first step for anything like that has to occur with the improvement of PWSA to make it an attractive base. And in the future, a regional authority probably wouldn't even be called PWSA. It would be something else, and its governance would change with the membership, with its community membership. So what we're looking for in each of these options is, what are the operations and maintenance savings? What are the benefits of risk-based asset management, and how is it deployed? You can employ risk-based asset management as a public entity or a private entity. Right now, it's simply more prevalent in the private entities. What's the optimal value-based capital program? The capital programs are not, even though the needs are obvious, they will be done differently. There will be different priorities. Part of it's a personal opinion, part of it's an engineering perspective, but they will differ depending upon which the options are selected. And the efficient and effective support services, the back office, the customer service, the billing, the meters. One observation is if the utility were to be transferred to a local gas or electric company or something like that, the first thing they will do is to replace all of those meters. One, because meter reading right now is a tedious task. The other is because what happens with the old meters, which Pittsburgh has, the old meters actually start to lose their precision. So the household actually ends up paying for less water than they actually use over time. So newer meters don't have that problem. They're all connected. They all talk to each other. As far as the billing goes, again, PWSA is already taking steps to address that. But any entity, any restructuring option will affect all of these pieces. I'll wrap up by saying that in our next meeting, oh, by the way, I should add that we've tried in the book here to provide, I think I already mentioned this, we've tried to provide mixed, balanced perspective, not balanced, but certainly one where you can see both sides of how people look at the same issues. And by hearing what they think of these options from both sides, I think you can probably arrive at your own perspective. Our next steps include we're going to continue the management operations and internal controls review, plus the restructuring options research. We're going to begin the community outreach, begin the financial and legal analysis, and begin the capital programming process assessment. As we get into October, we'll finalize a lot of that, but we'll also be heavy into the ratepayer impact analysis, as well as the final restructuring options, so that when we come up to November 8th, in advance of that, you'll have all of the information that we have been able to provide to you in the time period we've been given here. And then we will meet with you once formally, and perhaps even informally, so that you have the information and we can discuss your views and questions on what those findings were. And with that, I'll take your questions.
Yeah, so I just, first of all, just thank you. I think just impressions, maybe we'll talk. Obviously, as I said earlier, for the panel, whatever was on your mind in terms of questions, I do want to say that institutional change really starts with a candid, honest assessment of self. And if there's any if anybody questions whether or not the mayor's committed to change here and isn't afraid of the political fallout from taking a hard look at the existence of this authority, we would not have allowed your presentation to occur today. So I think that we're open, honest, candid, with respect to what we've inherited, the work that we've done as an administration. So the commitment is here. And again, all of you sort of heeded the mayor's call to come to the table and work on behalf of the public with respect to you're all busy folks as volunteers, and so I just appreciate your time. And so with that, would open up for questions. We're going to probably limit this about a half hour, and then I would want to give the opportunity for the public at the end to make their statements and ask questions as well to the team. So feel free, Mark, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, and thanks, Steve, and your thoroughness of your group is evident in the results of your report. And I think that's, clearly one of the reasons that differentiated you guys from, the others in that regard. It's hard to get an agreement, in environments like this about consensus on things, but I think most of us would agree in this room that the consensus is that the service hasn't been run well. There's systemic issues. And another consensus perhaps might be that cost of service will have to inevitably go up. And that's not something that I think, kind of any one of us wanted to hear, but I think it states the reality of where we go from here. So my question to you, though, is before we even get to the point of deciding who does what and what modality we use, is what does that budget look like? What does the convergence of the capital plan and the improvement of the authority as is, what does all that look like? And how do they converge with the replacements that are necessary, the improvements for the assets, so we can get to an intersection of defining the improvement plan, the cost of that improvement, and the cost of the taxpayer, before we even get to deciding which path we want to go down. When can we get to establishing what the costs are going to be to run a world-class facility?
Well, let's start with the capital program, since that's the primary variable here. The CFO has already begun a rate study that it takes what I would probably fairly call at this point hypothetical replacement needs and repair needs for the system over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. And that study is not yet finished, and I think when it is, you have to wait to see how that is implemented and through what option. The options do make a difference. If the capital program, the repairs program, to bring it to an acceptable level, it is not an acceptable level. It's unnecessary and too expensive to bring it to a pristine level. That means replacing all the pipes that have any leaks, all of the pumps that need repaired, all of the processes and repairs that need to be made. It's breathtaking. but you can get the system to a very good and sustainable state of repair by less than that. However, we are talking about billions of dollars here. That doesn't have to be spent immediately. It can be spent over the next 20, 30 years. It can be financed over an even longer period. Recently, DC Water financed some of its improvements over 100 years. And there was plenty of appetite for those bonds, shockingly. So this is not a problem that has to hit the current generation of ratepayers with every single dollar, but it's going to be large. But PWSA has some efforts underway to size the capital improvement program according to various scenarios. And now, again, I'm going to let them speak to the precision to those levels, and I know they're not quite prepared to do that, so I hesitate to say what I'm talking about is anything more than their hypotheticals at this point.
Steve, a few questions. First, as Kevin said, I appreciate the language you used, the bluntness of it, that you did not pull punches, and we need to hear that. I do have a specific question in that regard, though. You said, in one of your slides said, PWSA is a failed organization atop a dangerous and crumbling structure.
Yes.
What do you mean by dangerous? In what sense?
Go out to the field and look at the buildings.
Danger to whom?
They're in the sense that many of the buildings are actually buckling. Their foundations are undermined. The conditions we observed were we felt that would be dangerous, not necessarily to the public, but certainly people working among them. There are facilities that need to be fixed now. And Bob and his team are really working to do that. They're doing so on a shoestring budget. That's why I said I want to separate the longer-term capital program from sort of the immediate organizational and short-term fix.
Okay.
I do want to say, too, that just for the panel that we do have the leadership at PWSA here in the room as well, if they're Bob and Ken are both here. If there are further on questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer. Sorry.
I have three sort of technical questions.
Sure.
And you have to go deeply into them now because I'm sure this will be coming out as you go forward with your study. But in the briefing book, which looks very good, you say durability risk can improve considerably when ownership of the assets and responsibility for operations are separated. Could you explain that in sort of a short version of that?
Durability, I think where I used the term durability had to do with the internal improvement initiatives.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And whether they endure.
Right.
The question is, why would durability risk go down by separating the assets from operations?
The durability of change. It's the durability of the change of organization, not the durability of the assets.
Right.
And so
No,
whenever,
I get that.
right. And so that's why we separate those two when we talk about the problem of durability. You can have a capital program and anyone can implement that according to the strictures of the plan. But organizations, whether they're public or they're private, if they're not faced with either competition or constant attention to efficiency, tend to retreat back to their norm. If you've ever had a business and you didn't have competition, you got to admit you probably got a little lazy. Public organizations work the same way. When there isn't an impetus to stay absolutely focused, there is some slippage. Most of the time that slippage is not material. Here, it's important. A private operator, and this is again our experience, a private company that takes over a water and sewer utility, ideally will come into every day that the manager or supervisors come into their job, they are thinking about how do I reduce the cost of what I'm doing and maintain the quality of service that we are committed to.
So by separating, you get that focus on
Exactly.
that
Absolutely focused on that. And I have to say, at first I didn't completely understand that until I saw the private operators come in to a utility that had been previously managed fairly well. and sort of startled by the fact that, yes, there's some pressure from the top for that, but that's also what they do. That's the consciousness of what they do. And that staying that focused on the efficiency of your operations while maintaining quality is a really challenging thing to do. Yeah. You can be pretty good at it, but pretty good at it won't beat your competition out there. So that's now, and so making that durable requires something in addition to culture and in addition to a good attitude. It requires systems. And that's what you hear from, that's what you'll hear from Tulsa, is they faced a privatization threat. They knew they would have to change. When they decided to go with internal improvement, they worried about slippage back to the same old way of doing business. And that's why they focused their effort on putting in information systems and performance monitoring systems and providing new tools that collected all that performance data underneath the surface, so that management and the board of directors could see it. And moreover, there was a contract between the city and the utility to see to it that those challenging parameters were met, that those efficiencies and quality of service were maintained, not just a verbal promise of, yes, we'll do a good job.
I get it. Next one. You say IMG does not believe that managed competition is a viable restructuring instrument for PWSA. Why?
It assumes that the public staff, a managed competition, a fair managed competition in which the employees have a reasonable chance to win that competition, assumes that the public and private competitors are on equal terms in terms of their knowledge, in terms of their training, and in terms of the tool sets that are available to them. In this particular case, just starting with the tool sets are so widely divergent from what any operator would bring in. The skill level, the licensing, I mean, the lack of licensed engineers, operating engineers in PWSA is breathtaking. It's yet the private entity would come in with all of those things. And so if you have a competition, it's not a fair fight.
Got it. Last question. I'm really intrigued by the public trust idea. And in the case of Indy, right?
Yeah.
They had an existing public trust that was their gas utility in effect, and it took over the water system.
Yes.
Are you aware of any situation where you had a private regulated utility that was converted into a public trust? And then...
That's a very good question, and we didn't research that, but it is quite likely that that has been the case in the past, where a private entity, perhaps owned by a family, for example, may have been the owner of a utility founded at the beginning, at the city's early beginnings, like especially a gas utility, would be a very good example. In fact, in Indianapolis, the gas utility, the public trust, was actually founded by a group of wealthy individuals in Indianapolis who realized they weren't going to be around forever and wanted to do some public good, and so they actually put their assets into a public perpetual trust, very much as a number of estates do. So
but maybe your team could research that a little bit.
We will certainly research that. It's very, very possible that an investor-owned utility has converted to a public trust in the past.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate hearing your findings this morning. I had two questions, and one relates to the transparency and outreach. I appreciate that you'll have a website available and that you'll be able to track community resident responses on that, and that the libraries will have information as well. But I don't know if that necessarily goes out enough to the outreach component. The transparency, certainly. But related to outreach, I would have envisioned some more direct conversations with the community, just as PWSA had community meetings when we had the issue with DEP and the lead service lines and the elevated lead levels in water. There was an opportunity throughout the city to have the customers, the ratepayers, come and have a conversation and learn more about that process and become engaged in that. And so I would anticipate and want to see perhaps some of these community-style meetings across the city as well, to really have that back and forth interaction that I think is necessary. the comments on the website just feel like it's a little more one-sided. And I really think that outreach has to be much more direct.
So because of the compressed time.
Up to the mic, sorry.
Because of the compressed time, I think that it's a very valid point. It's deciding where and when to have those meetings and make sure that they're available to as many residents as possible. That's something that we can work with the mayor's office and with Steve to make available, perhaps having a community meeting. Also making sure that the community meeting, we answer the questions that are really important to the study and to what this panel is in charge of. One of my concerns was if we just go the route of community meetings, that they might digress into a conversation that we're not even charged with necessarily handling. And I wanted to make sure that what this panel is supposed to be in charge of doing is getting out to the community. But it's not a no, it's a let's see if we can coordinate. I think it's a very valid point.
I was thinking of that as well, that those kind of meetings, you can have lots of issues that go far and away from what the task is here at hand. And so managing that, I'm sure, is something that would have to happen and be thoughtful about. But the other thing is it may uncover some things that would be valuable to the team here in terms of what a ratepayer experience is. And so I think that that's really important to gather.
And I agree with you. And hopefully, maybe what we can also do is structure a component to the site and then to do community outreach, asking specific questions from the ratepayer. I'm hoping that we'll be collecting their main concerns and how we can address them. So I agree.
Okay, thank you. And the other question, Steve, comes under the bullet of strategy. So you've highlighted and talked about the current panacea regarding the PUC regulation and how that cover would provide cover for dramatically higher water and sewer rates, thereby providing a windfall to buy its way out of its problems, and that accordingly such PUC intervention is at best very premature. Have there been discussions with any of our elected officials to understand that process a little bit more and to see if that's actually moving forward? Because I would be concerned that that would hinder the process here at hand and all of the good work that's being done.
All of that has, there was a flurry of activity, I think, in July, and I haven't, and it's certainly our legal folks have been paying attention to it, a lot of attention to it, because that's our perspective is that that's premature, and I'm concerned, and my concern was that you would lose local stakeholder faith if that was the solution.
I can weigh in it.
Yes.
Just in terms of the conversation in Harrisburg, there was a bill that was passed through the Senate. The House bill had been amended and sort of back into the House. So unfortunately, Harrisburg is gridlocked on the budget right now. And that being said, the administration, I personally was up there 2 times lobbying on behalf of the bill. We think that having an additional layer of public oversight with the PUC is not a bad thing. So long as the transition from PWSA in terms of the rate structure, there's a lot of regulations that come along with that, all meant to really protect the public, more from a consumer perspective. Governance regarding how you spend money. Right now, the authority itself is accountable to the appointed members. There would be a requirement that, for instance, the prosecution of a long-term capital improvement plan is open and subject to regulation by the PUC. So there are elements of the bill. There are bad parts to it. And again, you're giving up sort of self-governance as a municipal authority, but there was a lot of good. So the answer is it's moved. The conversations have occurred. There were amendments made with the help of folks in the Senate who are from our delegation here in Allegheny County who paid a lot of attention to it. But it's right now stuck in the House.
Yeah, I would say that if there is a transfer, if the preferred option here is to transfer the utility even to a nonprofit trust, but also to either a private investor-owned utility or via a concession, that will immediately go under PUC regulation automatically. The question that we've primarily had is this organization capable of dealing with the PUC? And dealing with the expectations of the PUC with regard to the capital program and the management of and dealing with higher rates. It's not going to solve the organizational problem, and our belief is the organization has to be ready for it, and right now it's not.
Just one last point on that as well. We made it very clear that any move toward PUC oversight we would not accept if that were being done to make a decision about the future of the authority. For instance, to privatize the authority, or that the PUC, as has been done in the past in Philadelphia with the gas works, where perhaps that political authority through Harrisburg was made to sort of manipulate the local authority towards a particular outcome. The future of this authority is going to be made by the residents of the city of Pittsburgh, through all of us, the recommendations we made, through our elected officials at City Council and folks, the mayor, and as well as the board members at PWSA. And so to the extent that there was a move in Harrisburg to push this authority toward a particular outcome, that's something that is not acceptable to us. Other questions from the
question on whether or not, and I appreciate your report, and I appreciate sort of the comments, and some of them as someone that's been in this organization for a few years rang true. Some did not. So I guess the question is there was a deep operational dive into taking a look at PWSA, is that correct?
As deep as we could do so far, and in the time available to us.
I think one thing that would be helpful, at least from my perspective, is to see an actual report. I think it's helpful to understand the current state, truly understand the current state before you make a decision on the process to get to some future state. I mean, I mean, we can all generally probably agree with operationally what we would like the future state to be, but I'd like to get a good grasp because, to be frank, over 3 years when I served on the board, I saw various different reports on what the current state was, and I'm sure the other board members could say this, and 6 months later we saw a report that showed the current state was something different. So understanding, truly understanding, and seeing it in documentation. Hey, when you say something like buildings are crumbling, right? About to fall down. It would be helpful, I think, to know what buildings are crumbling, right? Sure. The meters are old and need to be replaced with new meters. Once again, it'd be helpful to know, well, what's the inventory? Because I think everybody that's aware of the meters are aware that the authority replaced all its meters, at least its residential meters, a few years ago, 2.5, 3 years ago. So if those are old meters now, or they were wrongly purchased, it'd be helpful to understand the current state. So I think that type of baseline assessment would be helpful when we're looking at your recommendations on how we should proceed forward. So.
The people who did the review do have their notes, and I have their draft reports. Some of the pieces I pulled out of those reports are they're not the scariest parts of the reports. So, we can certainly have those. I wanted to make sure that we were thorough, but at the same time, I wanted to make sure that the panel was attentive to the issues that we did see out there. The concern was not that senior management doesn't know about them, and not that they are trying to address them, but the resources to address those issues appear to be lacking. And that's what we wanted to make sure, is that you understood that the resources need to be there.
Jen?
First of all, thank you for your presentation. My question is similar to Alex's. Given that PWSA is doing kind of their own internal capital planning, which is no small feat to go 20, 30 years out, do you have any recommendations to get us to that baseline so that we do have a clear understanding of what that capital program should look like, and then from there what our risk assessment appetite should be when it comes to whether it's traditional asset management or the risk-based asset management?
want to separate the capital programming from the asset management somewhat.
Okay.
They are very much related, and some of that goes to the fact that in most utilities, unfortunately, the maintenance and the capital programming are so separated that you couldn't call it asset management. You could call it maintenance and capital programming.
Right.
I do know that Bob and his team are trying to get a much better handle on that long-term prospect. And indeed, Tetra Tech, when it begins its process and looking at the capital programming process, they'll be working with them closely to understand, what the needs are there, what the information needs are, and where they are. I know they're in the middle of the processes. They're getting a number of consultant reports. Remembering that those reports will not be definitive, in the sense that there's always more research, always more planning, and always more refinement that needs to be done. In most of the utilities we've gone into in their capital programming processes, when we've looked at those, the whole asset management perspective, and effectively blended the maintenance and asset and capital programming functions via an asset management process, all of a sudden the capital program changes. All of a sudden the priorities change. And so it's never quite cast in stone. But no, this is very much a close relationship. We don't have the time or the resources to second guess what Bob and his team are up to. Instead, it's, how can that process be improved? What are the needs right now for improving that process?
Other questions from the panel? Councilwoman?
I'm not on the blue ribbon panel, right? So I was a council person and board member and the advisory committee to the panel. Thank you for your report. And it's been a long process of continuing to turn over stones. We keep saying this, right? We want to know where the problems are. For too long, no one was looking under those rocks to find out what the problems were. So thank you to everybody here for being willing to take that hard look. One thing that is my daily experience representing constituents is really in the water distribution and sewer transmission system. Your presentation certainly was disturbing on our water plant. But so two things really are impressive, right? That we have such a dire situation at the water plant is distressing. And we need to know that, and we need to know how to move forward. But secondly, that we're losing 50% of our water is also something we've known for a while, right? But that's not at the water plant. If we had a magic wand today and could just kind of plop down a brand new water plant, we'd still be losing 50% of our water, right? So the billions is not at the water plant.
You're right.
And the majority of your presentation today is the most immediate and distressing situation that we need to fix the water plant. But let us not forget to keep in front of us that we have 1,000 miles of water distribution lines and 1,500 miles of sewer transmission lines that are really the bulk of the system, and is my daily experience, right? Because that's why the sinkhole is in the street. That's why someone's basement is filling up. That's why we have lead water service lines that we need to worry about are in every inch of the city footprint. And similarly, I keep repeating this point, we're rebuilding the city. And so let us remember that it's not just above ground that we have to worry about, that we have to worry about below ground as well. And we have 1,000 miles of street. And guess what? Those water lines and those sewer lines are under those streets. And we know 500 miles of those city streets are structurally deficient and going to be rebuilt, that those neighborhoods are going to be rebuilt, that we have to approach how we're fixing everything in the right of way. We have mobility issues. We have redevelopment in some places and still depopulation in others. We know that we need, it's literally a 50-mile square mile radius of a water system that we're rebuilding. And I said it before, I think when we started this process, let's keep in front of us the system that we need to build as we're thinking through what are the financing and what are the governance structures that we need to create. So I just wanted to remind us that the water plant in Aspinwall that was one of the frankest and most distressing descriptions, and so it's good to have that technical expertise on some of the most immediate problems. But there's the long-term structural problems as well. So, thank you,
Councilwoman. I think you're absolutely correct that the vast majority of the expenditures in the long-term capital program will be underground, and unfortunately, that will be the most challenging for the city as a whole to deal with. The good news is that more information is being gathered on the underground structures. None of it's very encouraging, but yes, you're correct, and it does take a different, and that means there'll be a different approach. Some of these options will be probably a little better at dealing with underground infrastructure than others.
Thank you, Councilman. Alex?
Yes, so Steve, thank you for your report. If you walk into the water treatment plant today, you'll see a plaque. The plaque is right at the entrance to the lab, and it says that the building was dedicated in 1969. So we're almost 50 years into it. In 1969, that was a state-of-the-art plant. And it was built by local contractors and engineering firms here who built it to the specifications. But as we all know, almost 50 years later, it needs some attention. I don't disagree with the report that IMG presented today. I probably would choose different words in some of the presentations. I don't think that it's Stone Age, but I do think we certainly have a lot of investment to make. But I think if you're watching at home and people who are worried about their water system, I think it's important to know that there are a tremendous amount of dedicated people every day, from the mayor's office to former board members to the current board to Bob Weimer's staff, who are working tirelessly to keep this together until we have a solution. I think that it's clear that what we have now is not sustainable, and that we need some type of restructuring and some type of investment. But I want folks at home to know that there are a lot of folks who spent this past weekend working 24/7 dealing with issues, and I think that's important.
I think that's very well said. Again, when we started this conversation to prep for this meeting, there was a clear directive by the mayor's office that there should be no sugarcoating. That the presentation you saw today was the first time I saw it, and just in terms of our commitment to the process. But that's sort of a picture of where we are right now, and we've hired folks to come in here and inform us on the status. And just to echo Alex's point, we do have people working very hard every day. We've made a lot of progress, even in the last 6 months, dealing with issues, regulatory issues with the DEP, safety issues and the like. So this is a candid assessment to inform some very hard decisions that we have to make here about the future of this authority, and I think that candor is something that is necessary, for us to make those decisions. But it doesn't portray the fact that we have, very hardworking, dedicated people, which I think came through, your, part of your presentation, and they have
foxhole valor.
Right. There are plans, and I think we know what we need to do. It's the question on how do we get there, and what's the best structure for us to have the resources and the expertise to deliver. And I think that's really what this engagement is at least from our perspective here from the city, was intended to procure. So any other questions or comments from the panel for today? Steve, anything else for the good of the order from your team?
No, just that there is a lot more to come.
Okay. So with that, if panel members would humor, I'd like to open it up for public comment. So if you'd like to, you could leave, either make a comment or ask a question, maybe try to limit it to maybe a minute or two. But if you do, could you just please approach the podium?
Frederick White, Pennsylvania Interfaith Impact Network. While we appreciate the website and the transparency of the website that comes with it, I'd like to express our disappointment at the absence of any real public input at least to this point, and would ask the Blue Ribbon Panel to withhold any conclusion without fully opening up that process to the public. Also, not without with the mayor's expression of his desire to keep this process and PWSA public not being lost on us. I struggled as I listened with all of the presentation, apparently offering at least some form of privatization, and would hope that the panel would consider the promises that the mayor's made to the public as you consider this decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. I just want to echo, I think Michelle encouraging the team to have, you know, a public meeting where, you know, we can sort of be vulnerable and talk about these issues and have people show up and ask those questions. That's something that I think is essential. And so we'll work with you to echo the comments made that, you know, we should be, and again, this is sort of the starting line. You're going to present options, and there'll be a lot of public commentary to sort of decide which options are there. But I do think even discerning those options is worthy of a public commentary. So we'll work with you guys to set that up. Any other questions from the public? Okay, so our next public meeting on this will be, is it September 12th? And so just for the, we did release a copy this morning from the mayor's office as part of the press release for today, an electronic copy of the briefing book. So that is available on the city's website. We'll also make sure that we're communicating the website that you guys are setting up to make sure that, you know, all of the documents that are leading into this are open for public review and comments. So with that, I just appreciate your time throughout this process. You know, this started from even selecting this team, and I know some of you sort of agreeing to stay on to help guide us through the future of this authority is something that I personally, and I know the mayor appreciates very well. It's a lot of hard work ahead of us, a lot of time. You're all very busy people. And on behalf of the residents, I just appreciate your attention and your participation in this. It's probably one of the most important things that we'll do as administration is, you know, not kick the can down the road any further. You know, expend the political capital to make the right decisions here because it's one of the most important things that we have ahead of us. And I can't think of a better group of people to sit around the table and try to do it together. So thanks for your time today, and meeting adjourned. Thank you.